The rain fell in sheets, drenching the earth and making the night air thick with damp. Duke Tristan stood in the garden at Stormholt Manor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His once regal posture had crumbled under the weight of guilt and despair. He had never imagined he'd be reduced to this, a man on his knees, begging. Yet here he was, his voice hoarse, calling her name, pleading for forgiveness. The storm roared in the background, but it was nothing compared to the storm inside him. Then, as quickly as it had come, the scene dissolved. The rain, the pain, the begging Duke, gone in an instant. The world snapped back into focus, and Kit's heart still pounded from the phantom ache of the moment. She stood in the grand ballroom at Ashworth House, surrounded by laughter and the hum of society's finest. The air was thick with perfumes and whispered gossip, the sounds of a celebration she didn't want to be a part of. It was the night of the Ashworth Ball, and everything should have been perfect. The ball was a highlight of the season, the event that promised a night of beauty and romance. Yet for Kit, it was a night of misery in the making. She had spent most of the evening trying to avoid the stares, the murmurs. It wasn't that she was unfamiliar with the delicate art of fitting in. Kit had grown up in society's glare. Her family was well known, and her father's name carried weight in the social circles of London. But none of that mattered now. After the scandal with Lord Locksley and the rumors that followed, Kit had become a walking target for gossip. Every glance, every word, every movement felt like a reminder that her reputation had been ruined, her worth questioned. Her mind wandered, tried to escape the suffocating air of the ballroom. And that's when she saw him, Duke Tristan. He was standing across the room, speaking to some of the other men of the ton, his tall frame unmistakable in the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. He had always been a figure of power and allure, but tonight he looked different, tired. His usual confidence seemed to have faltered, though the mask of composure remained. Kit couldn't help but watch him. She knew he was engaged to Octavia, her once close friend. The engagement had been arranged months ago, and it was supposed to be a match made in heaven, perfectly aligned with the expectations of society. Yet, something felt wrong now. Kit couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she could sense the distance between the two of them. She was trying to avoid the thoughts, those familiar pangs of jealousy, hurt, and longing, when she heard the voice. It came from behind her, but it didn't sound distant. It was close enough for her to catch every cruel syllable. I'll never understand why he picked her. Kit, of all people. She'll never be more than a disappointment. It was Lord Tristan, Duke's cousin, speaking to a group of men nearby. The word struck like a slap. She's not even fit to be his mistress, another man said, his voice dripping with disdain. Kit froze, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to turn and confront them, to tell them they were wrong, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Her hands clenched, nails digging into her palms as she tried to steady herself. She had overheard insults before. The ton was cruel, and it was nothing new. But this came from Duke Tristan himself, the man who had once shown her kindness, who had once made her feel as if she could be more. Kit's vision blurred as she tried to process the harsh truth. He thought her unworthy. She had been foolish to ever believe there could be something more between them. This was the Duke's true opinion of her, shared in the most casual, thoughtless way. She couldn't stay here, not under these circumstances. Her heart sank, and a wave of humiliation washed over her. Her cheeks flushed with heat, her chest tight with betrayal. She had hoped, in some small corner of her heart, that she might still have a place in his life, however insignificant it might be. But now it was clear. She wasn't even worthy of respect. Without thinking, Kit turned on her heel, fleeing the ballroom before anyone could see her tears. She hurried down the grand staircase, barely noticing the swirls of silken gowns and polished boots around her. She didn't care where she was going, only that she needed to escape. Outside, the rain pelted her face, but she welcomed it. She let the droplets mix with the tears that were already blurring her vision. She wasn't sure why she had expected anything different. She wasn't a princess, not even a proper lady in the eyes of the ton. But as she rounded the corner of the manor, she froze. The words that she hadn't wanted to hear had already been spoken. And yet there was more. A low, familiar voice echoed from the shadows near the garden, followed by a harsh, mocking laugh. "Lord Locksley will handle everything," Octavia whispered, her voice as cold as the night air. "With Kit out of the picture, I'll finally have Tristan. It's all too easy. He'll never know what hit him." Kit's blood ran cold as she realized what she had just overheard. Betrayal. She had thought, perhaps naively, that Octavia might be her friend again, that her kindness toward her would be returned. But now it was clear. Octavia had never been on her side. She had been plotting this all along, using Lord Locksley to push her aside. Kit's stomach churned with disgust as the full weight of the betrayal hit her. She felt a fire stir inside her. It wasn't just about her humiliation anymore. It was about the truth. Octavia had to be stopped. The Duke needed to know. Kit couldn't remain silent. She wouldn't. But the question remained. Could she warn him, or was it too late for her to matter? As the storm raged on above her, Kit's resolve hardened. She would speak the truth, no matter the consequences. She would show them all what she was truly capable of. And so, as the rain soaked through her gown, Kit made her decision. She would not be the woman they assumed her to be. She would rise. The days that followed the overheard conversation felt like an endless blur of confusion and dread. Kit's mind was a tumult of emotions, torn between a moral dilemma that gnawed at her and the mounting sense of betrayal she could not ignore. Should she warn Duke Tristan about Octavia's plot? The thought haunted her, its weight pressing down on her chest every waking moment. She had spent so many years trying to blend in, trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect friend, the perfect lady, only to be met with ridicule and disdain. Yet now, when it mattered most, she faced the choice to act, to expose the treachery, or to remain silent and allow the unfolding disaster to occur. The very thought of alerting Tristan made her heart pound with both a sense of duty and deep fear. He was the last person she ever wanted to speak to again. He had been kind once. Yes, maybe even more than kind, with his warm words and gentle attentions. But those days were long gone. He had shown her exactly where she stood in his life, and it was not anywhere near his heart. She couldn't forget the sting of his words, the way he had dismissed her so callously. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore what she had overheard. A betrayal like this couldn't go unpunished, not for her sake, but for the sake of all the women who had ever been manipulated by those with power. Despite the searing ache in her heart, despite the bitterness that burned her every time she thought of him, she knew what she had to do. She had to warn him. The realization came to her in a sharp breath as she stood alone in the dimly lit drawing room. The weight of the decision settling in. If she didn't, Octavia's deceit would destroy everything, and she couldn't stand by and let that happen. Her pride, however battered, wasn't enough to silence the voice that urged her to do the right thing. Kit found herself standing at the threshold of a moment she had never imagined herself in, facing a man who had broken her heart, yet needing to tell him the truth. The confrontation was inevitable, and so, after days of restless pondering, Kit gathered every last ounce of her courage and resolved to seek him out. The encounter wasn't easy. It never could have been. When she arrived at the Duke's estate, she was greeted with a cold reception. Nothing more than a formal nod from his butler, a glance that was sharp and dismissive, as if her very presence was unwanted. Kit's nerves fluttered, and she tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that she wasn't here for herself. She wasn't here for his kindness or his approval. She was here because something had to be done, something that would prevent a disaster from unfolding. She was here because Octavia had to be stopped, and Tristan needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When Duke Tristan finally appeared, he was dressed in dark formal attire, his posture as impeccable as always, but his eyes seemed distant, almost empty. He regarded her with an unreadable expression, and for a long moment neither spoke. Kit found herself fighting to maintain her composure under his gaze. She wasn't sure what to say. After everything that had transpired, after the years of silence and the cutting words he'd thrown at her, what did she even owe him? But as his gaze softened, if only slightly, the words came to her. "Tristan," she began, her voice low and unsteady, "I overheard something you need to know." His eyebrows furrowed, and his lips twisted in skepticism. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone barely concealing his impatience. But Kit didn't back down. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. "It's about Octavia. She's planning to betray you. She's been using Lord Locksley to manipulate you, to get what she wants. She's been plotting against you both, and she'll stop at nothing to get what she wants. I couldn't stay silent any longer. You need to know." His expression hardened, his jaw clenching as if he had not expected this. There was a moment of stunned silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Tristan's gaze flickered to the window, his fingers tightening on the edge of the chair as he absorbed what she had said. Kit felt her heart pounding, unsure whether she was relieved to have said the truth or terrified of the consequences. His silence was deafening. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, he spoke. "Why should I believe you?" The question was blunt, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What reason would you have to warn me? To come here and tell me something like that?" His words stung more than she expected, as if he was questioning her integrity, her very honesty. But Kit didn't flinch. She didn't have time for his doubts. "Because it's the right thing to do," she replied, her voice firm. "Because I've seen enough lies and manipulation in my life, and I won't stand by and let anyone suffer because of it." His eyes searched her face, lingering on her features, as if trying to understand what had driven her to take this step. The frustration and pain in his eyes were unmistakable. "And you think I need your help?" he scoffed, shaking his head. "You think I need you to tell me what I've already known?" His words hit her like a slap, and for a brief moment, Kit felt the familiar sting of humiliation. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that he might show some gratitude for her honesty, but instead, he seemed to dismiss her entirely. He stood, running a hand through his dark hair, frustration evident in the way his fists clenched at his sides. "I should have known," he muttered under his breath. "I should have seen it myself." He turned away, pacing in the small study, his thoughts clearly racing. "You've done your part," he said finally, his voice less harsh but still laced with anger. "I'll take care of it. But don't expect me to thank you. You've only brought more trouble." Kit's chest tightened at the coldness of his words, but she swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. She had done what she needed to do. She had warned him. She hadn't expected a grand thank you or a change of heart, but the emptiness of his reaction still stung. She left him with one final word. "I already know I'd never make a Duchess." The words slipped from her mouth before she could stop them. A final confession, a piece of herself she had hidden for so long. It wasn't a statement of self-pity, nor was it an attempt to gain sympathy. It was the truth, plain and simple. The truth that had been whispered in her mind for years. The truth that she had kept buried until now. And just like that, with those words hanging between them, Kit turned and left. She couldn't stay any longer. She had done what she came to do. What happened next was up to him. Weeks later, Tristan took action. He uncovered Octavia's betrayal and confronted her, the truth spilling out like a floodgate breaking open. The engagement between Duke Tristan and Octavia was officially broken, and Octavia's scheming was exposed for all of London to see. It was a scandal that rocked the ton, but Kit's role in revealing the truth remained hidden. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, Kit remained in the background, not seeking recognition or gratitude. She was content to know that she had done the right thing, even if it didn't bring her the peace or resolution she had hoped for. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger. She had given him the truth. What he did with it was entirely up to him. One evening, as Kit sat alone in the garden at her family's home, lost in her thoughts, she heard a familiar voice. She turned to find Duke Tristan standing at the garden gate, his expression unreadable. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gesture, only a quiet, simple truth in his eyes. "I found out what happened," he said, his voice low. "Octavia's betrayal. I never saw it coming." His eyes softened as he stepped closer, his presence suddenly far less imposing, more vulnerable. "You deserve everything." The words were a whisper, but they sent a shiver through her. Kit didn't know how to respond. He was still the Duke, still a man of immense power and influence, and yet in that moment, His words felt like an apology, an admission of something deeper than she had anticipated, something more than she could have ever imagined. The weeks following Kit's confrontation with Duke Tristan were a storm in themselves, an emotional whirlwind of confusion, hurt, and broken trust. Octavia, with her cruel grace and calculated charm, wasted no time turning the scandal to her advantage, spreading vicious rumors about Kit across every corner of London society. Whispers followed Kit wherever she went, and it wasn't long before the rumors took root. They painted her as a manipulative schemer, as someone who had plotted all along to destroy the Duke's engagement, all while pretending to be the innocent victim. Kit, who had always prided herself on being a lady of dignity, found herself the subject of cruel gossip, her name dragged to the mud by those who had once been her friends. Society, ever eager to condemn those who fell from grace, turned its back on her completely. Invitations to events ceased, and once friendly faces now avoided her with cold, deliberate indifference. Even her own family seemed uncertain how to react to the growing scandal. Her mother, a woman who had once held her head high with pride in Kit's reputation, now seemed distant, almost apologetic, as though unsure how to shield her daughter from the storm. Her father, normally so assured and composed, appeared increasingly worried, his every conversation with her tinged with a sense of concern that bordered on disappointment. Kit had always been their pride and joy, the perfect daughter with the perfect future ahead of her. Now, she felt like a shadow of the person she used to be. Her mother's disapproving silences and her father's quiet suggestions to stay out of the public eye only served to deepen her sense of isolation. It was as though the walls were closing in on her from every side, and she was powerless to stop it. Her world, once full of potential and promise, now felt like an endless hallway leading to a dead end. Yet, amid the growing isolation, a small part of Kit couldn't quite ignore the presence that had begun to stir in the back of her mind. The Duke. After their tense confrontation, she had expected him to disappear from her life completely, his dismissal of her a clear signal that he no longer cared. But instead, to her surprise, the Duke had started showing up in places she least expected. He began defending her in quiet, subtle ways, across London, at social gatherings, and even in private circles. His name came up more than once as he insisted that Kit was innocent of things she had been accused of. It was almost as though he was trying to repair the damage done to her reputation, though no one quite understood why. The gossip around town had reached its peak, but Duke Tristan remained adamant, speaking against the lies with surprising fierceness that took many by surprise. Kit had no idea why he was doing this. She hadn't expected him to stand up for her, especially after everything that had transpired. Her heart, once filled with anger and resentment, found a small spark of gratitude for him, though it was tangled up with the confusion of why he would bother. Perhaps it was out of guilt, she thought, or maybe it was because he had seen through Octavia's manipulation. Whatever the reason, she couldn't deny that Tristan's quiet defense was making a difference, however small it might be. Still, the damage to Kit's reputation seemed irreparable. She spent most of her days at home, tending to her private affairs, and occasionally slipping into moments of reflection. It was during one of these moments, as she sat in the study with her mother, that the Duke unexpectedly arrived. Kit had heard a knock on the door, followed by a soft, deliberate voice asking for her presence. She wasn't sure what to expect, but when she entered the drawing room, she found herself face to face with him. The Duke stood tall, his usual air of authority softened by the weariness in his eyes. "Kit," he began, his voice careful but steady, "I've come to speak with you." She remained silent, unsure what to say. It had been weeks since their last interaction, and the memories of his harsh words were still fresh in her mind. Yet, there he was, standing in front of her, as though nothing had ever happened. There was no apology in his eyes, but there was something different, something that made her stand still and listen. "I've been hearing the rumors," he continued, and Kit couldn't stop herself from flinching. "I know what they're saying about you, and I want you to know that I've done what I can to stop it. I've defended your name in the ton. I didn't want you to think I had abandoned you or that I agreed with the lies." The words were unexpected, and they hit Kit harder than she could have imagined. She wasn't sure whether she should be angry or grateful. He had spoken, but the sting of his earlier dismissal still lingered in her heart. She wanted to challenge him, to demand why he was only now speaking to her. But something in his expression made her hesitate. There was a raw honesty in his gaze, a vulnerability that had never been there before. "Why?" she asked softly, unable to keep the question inside. "Why now? Why defend me?" Tristan hesitated, as though he had to search for the right words. "Because," he said quietly, "I owe you that. I know I've treated you badly, and I've been wrong about many things. But this isn't your fault. It never was." There was a weight to his words, a sincerity that made Kit's breath catch in her throat. He was admitting something she hadn't expected, that perhaps he, too, had been wrong. Perhaps the walls he had built around himself had begun to crumble even just a little. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I can't stand by and let you suffer because of things that aren't true." Kit's heart fluttered, a mix of emotions stirring within her. Anger, relief, confusion. She had spent so long hating him, resenting him for his coldness, for the way he had discarded her. And yet here he was, standing before her, making an effort to make things right, at least in the smallest of ways. There was a long silence between them, and Kit realized that this moment was more than just a conversation. It was a turning point. For the first time, she saw him not as a distant, aloof Duke, but as a man who was willing to confront his own mistakes. It was an unsettling realization, and one that filled her with a mix of emotions. She wasn't sure she could forgive him. Not yet, but she could see that he was trying, and perhaps that was the most important step. After a moment, Kit spoke, her voice steady but filled with the complexity of her emotions. "Thank you," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "But I don't need your defense. I can stand on my own." Tristan's expression softened, though there was still a trace of regret in his eyes. "I know," he replied quietly. "But I wanted you to know, in case there was any doubt, that I don't believe any of the lies they've said about you. You deserve more than what they've given you. You always have." Kit didn't know how to respond. She didn't know if she could accept his words, or if they were enough to erase the damage that had already been done. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something stir in her chest. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe it was just a recognition that, even in their brokenness, they could still reach out to each other. They stood in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, until at last, Tristan spoke again. "I know this isn't easy, and I don't expect it to be, but if you'll allow me, I would like to make it right." Kit looked at him, uncertainty still clouding her expression. She wasn't sure what that meant or how he intended to make things right, but in that moment, she realized something important. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He was simply offering her a chance. Whether or not she took it was up to her. In the end, Kit realized that the road to redemption wasn't just about the others. It was about herself, too. It was about how she chose to stand in the face of adversity, and how she chose to move forward. In the weeks that followed Duke Tristan's unexpected defense of her, Kit's life seemed to shift imperceptibly, as if the world had tilted slightly on its axis, offering her a different perspective, though one she still couldn't fully understand. The whispers that had once been a constant, oppressive presence began to subside, but the damage remained. Kit wasn't foolish enough to believe her reputation would return to its former glory overnight, and the judgment of the ton still weighed heavily upon her. Yet there was a small, quiet change, a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Tristan, despite his earlier coldness, continued to show up, often unexpectedly, seeking her out in the most casual of moments. It was never grand, never dramatic. He would appear at a garden party, a private gathering, or sometimes simply in her mother's drawing room. At first, Kit had assumed it was all part of some duty he felt obligated to uphold. After all, he had defended her name, and surely he had to maintain some semblance of politeness. But it became clear, with each passing day, that there was more to his visits than simple courtesy. He would linger just a moment longer in conversation, his gaze softer when it met hers, and his responses seemed to reveal an interest that went beyond societal duty. Kit, ever cautious, resisted the urge to read too much into it. The man who had once broken her heart with cruel, thoughtless words couldn't be the same man now, could he? But then again, she realized she didn't know him at all. Not really. And that fact unnerved her. It was during one of these moments, when they were alone in the garden at Ashworth House, that Kit found herself facing a new kind of vulnerability. It had started as a simple disagreement, as many of their conversations had, over something trivial, perhaps the proper way to prune roses, or the best way to navigate the unspoken rules of high society. They stood together beneath the canopy of the garden's towering oak trees, their voices rising in friendly argument. Tristan was so engrossed in the conversation that he leaned in a little closer, and Kit, caught up in the moment, found herself challenging him more than she ever had before. She was surprised by the ease with which the words came, as if she had never felt the weight of social decorum. With every word they exchanged, something between them shifted, an electricity in the air, an unspoken understanding. He seemed fascinated by her opinions, genuinely engaged in her perspective, and for the first time in a long while, Kit realized how much he enjoyed his attention. His brow furrowed, and a half-smile tugged at the corner of his lips, as if he found her contradictions charming. There was an openness between them now, a space where the masks they wore for the rest of the world didn't exist. Kit's laughter came easily, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. And for the first time since her reputation had been shattered, she allowed herself to simply be. For the first time in weeks, perhaps even months, she didn't feel the burden of judgment. She didn't feel the weight of society's cruel expectations. She felt lighter. Tristan, too, seemed to relax, his earlier stiff formality melting away as he leaned back against the stone railing of the garden. There was an honesty in the way he looked at her now, as if he were seeing her for who she truly was, and not the woman society had tried to make her. The change in their interactions was subtle but undeniable. What had once been a guarded, tense exchange now felt like something more, a beginning. And for the first time, Kit realized that she was beginning to fall into something she hadn't expected, a deeper connection with him. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. The Duke, the man who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a disappointment, was beginning to fascinate her. She saw in his eyes when they spoke, in the way his gaze lingered a little too long when they laughed together, in the small, unguarded moments when he seemed to forget his status and speak to her as an equal. She wasn't sure what it all meant, but she knew one thing for certain. The distance between them was shrinking. But there was another part of Kit that recoiled from the idea of letting herself fall for him. She had been down that path before, and it had only led to heartache. She had allowed herself to believe in him once, to think that there might be something more between them, only to have those hopes dashed when he dismissed her without a second thought. Could she truly open herself up again, knowing that she was vulnerable to him? Could she risk the possibility of being hurt once more? Yet, despite her reservations, she couldn't deny the pull between them. It was a magnetic force that seemed impossible to ignore. And though she tried to remain distant, tried to remind herself that he was still the Duke, still a man who had once treated her like she didn't matter, there was a growing part of her that couldn't quite stop herself from wanting more. Their moments together continued, a steady rhythm of quiet conversations and stolen glances, their connection deepening with each passing day. Kit began to see sides of Tristan she had never noticed before, his vulnerabilities, his hidden fears, his insecurities. They weren't always apparent, of course, and he never spoke of them outright, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now, something that made her feel as if he were slowly revealing himself in ways that no one else ever had. She was beginning to understand him, to see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade, and in return, he seemed to be learning about her in ways no one else had bothered to. Her mind and her heart had begun to dance to an unfamiliar rhythm, and she didn't know whether to embrace it or run from it. At Lady Peton's soiree, the evening took on a surreal quality. The sound of violins filled the room as the guests mingled, their laughter and conversation blending into a symphony of elegance and wealth. Kit stood by the grand piano, admiring the musicians who had gathered for performance, when her gaze met Tristan's across the room. There was something about the way he looked at her, something in his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, she forgot about the world around them. It was just the two of them in that moment, their connection undeniable. He moved toward her with that same calm, steady grace, his eyes never leaving hers. And before she could stop herself, Kit found her heart racing. He had come to stand beside her, close enough for their shoulders to brush, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. The music swirled around them, but all Kit could focus on was the look on his face. Intense, searching, as though he were about to say something important, something that might change everything between them. And then, as if in response to the tension that had been building between them for weeks, Kit felt it, his hand brush against hers, the touch so brief, so electric, that it sent a wave of heat through her. The simple contact, the warmth of his fingers against hers, sparked something deep inside her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the realization hit her like a thunderclap. She was no longer just caught in the undertow of her own doubts and fears. She was beginning to fall for him. The idea of it sent her spiraling, a mix of joy and terror flooding through her. She pulled her hand back, as if she had been burned, but the connection lingered between them, crackling in the air. Tristan, ever perceptive, looked at her with something in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher, something almost like understanding, like he knew exactly what was happening, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. Kit didn't know how to respond to that moment, to the way her heart was racing in her chest, or the way her pulse quickened every time he looked at her. She wasn't sure where it would lead, if anywhere at all. She wasn't sure she could let herself fall into this, into him. But as the night wore on, she couldn't help but wonder, what if this wasn't just a fleeting attraction, but something more? What if this was the beginning of something real? The possibility both excited and terrified her. But for the first time in a long time, Kit allowed herself to imagine it. Imagine a future where she could be happy, where she could be loved without fear. She wasn't sure if it would last or where it would go, but she knew one thing for certain. She was falling in love with him, and there was no turning back now. The night of Lady Peton's soiree, a dazzling affair of glimmering gowns, clinking crystal glasses and soft laughter, turned out to be more than Kit had ever anticipated. It was there, amidst a sea of glittering society, that Octavia made her move. She arrived fashionably late, as always, with a dramatic flair that seemed to steal the room's attention, her crimson dress flowing behind her like a cloak of malice. Kit had been prepared for the inevitable confrontation. She had steeled herself for the sharp barbs and venomous remarks, but nothing could prepare her for what came next. Octavia, with a triumphant gleam in her eye, walked up to the piano where Kit had been standing alone, admiring the musicians. With a cool, calculated smile, she stood before Kit, holding up a letter in her hand. Kit's own letter. Kit's heart skipped a beat, a surge of panic rising in her chest. The letter was supposed to remain private, a quiet, intimate expression of her feelings, a letter that had been meant for no one's eyes but her own. Yet here it was, in Octavia's hands, poised for display. "Ah, Kit!" Octavia's voice rang out in a mockingly sweet tone. "I'm afraid you've been caught. I couldn't help but overhear a rather intriguing letter of yours. Do you care to explain it to everyone here?" The room fell silent, the atmosphere shifting in an instant. All eyes turned toward them, some curious, others gleeful at the thought of more scandal. Kit's chest tightened, her face flushing with an intense heat. She could feel the judgment of every person in the room, the way they were all eager to hear what would unfold. Octavia had chosen this moment with purpose, knowing full well the weight of the letter and its contents. Kit had written it not in hopes of confessing her deepest secrets, but as an outpouring of vulnerability, something she had never truly shared with anyone. It was a letter expressing the uncertainty she had been living with for so long, the fear that she might never be able to trust herself, let alone anyone else. It spoke of love, of longing, of a future that felt just out of reach. It was never meant to be read aloud, never meant for public consumption. Octavia, with her predatory smile, had clearly intended to twist it into something scandalous, to turn it into an accusation, to expose Kit's private thoughts and paint them as something darker than they were. The room held its breath as Octavia began to read, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "To Duke Tristan," Octavia began, her words dripping with mockery, "I find myself thinking of the life you might offer me. A life of titles and riches, of endless balls and perfect moments. A life where I could be by your side. If only you could see me for what I am. If only you could love me as I am." Kit's stomach churned, the words feeling like a betrayal as they spilled from Octavia's lips. The message had been meant for Tristan alone, a reflection of the longing Kit had felt for so long, the confusion that had clouded her heart. And now, in this cruel twist of fate, it was being read aloud to a room full of people who knew nothing of her true feelings, who saw only the spectacle and not the pain behind the words. Kit's first instinct was to retreat, to run away, to hide from humiliation. But then, through the haze of shame and panic, she heard a voice that rang out with a clarity that silenced the room. "That's enough, Octavia." It was Tristan. He stood at the far side of the room, his presence commanding and undeniable. His eyes, once filled with cold dismissal, now burned with an intensity that Kit had never seen before. He strode toward the center of the room, his gaze fixed on Octavia as she continued to read, unaware of the storm brewing behind her. "I said that's enough," he repeated, his voice steady but full of authority. The tension in the room escalated as the Duke stepped forward, every movement precise, every gesture calculated. Octavia froze, the letter still held in her hands, but now her triumph seemed to falter under the weight of Tristan's presence. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharp, addressing her with a coldness that sent a shiver down Kit's spine. Octavia, taken aback by the sudden shift, stumbled over her words. I was only reading a letter, Tristan. Just a letter from Kit. A letter that has nothing to do with you," Tristan interjected, cutting her off. His eyes never left Octavia as he spoke, his gaze unwavering. "This is not a game, Octavia, and I will not stand by while you use Kit as a pawn in your twisted little games." Kit stood there, paralyzed, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had never seen Tristan like this fierce, this protective. She had never imagined that he would come to her defense in such a public and resolute way. "You," he continued, his voice cold and final, "are not welcome here. And as for you, Kit," he turned to face her, his expression softening, "you are not the villain in this story. You never were." The words were simple, but they hit Kit like a tidal wave. The room, once filled with whispers and judgment, now felt like a distant memory. She was no longer the object of cruel gossip, no longer a target of ridicule. The Duke had stepped in, not with an apology, not with a quiet defense, but with an undeniable proclamation of loyalty. Kit's heart skipped a beat as he turned back to her. "Kit," he said again, his voice lower now, filled with something more profound. "I need to say this. I love you. I have loved you from the moment I saw you, even when I was too blind to realize it." The words hung in the air, their weight felt in every corner of the room. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Kit couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as she tried to comprehend the enormity of his declaration. The room seemed to fade away, the music, the guests, the world outside, none of it mattered. It was just the two of them now. "I love you," Tristan repeated, his voice firm, yet vulnerable in a way she had never heard before. "And I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of letting other people dictate what we should be, who we should be. This is our moment, and I won't let it pass without telling you the truth." Tears sprang to Kit's eyes, her heart a whirlwind of emotions, relief, confusion, joy, and disbelief all colliding. She had never imagined that this moment, this impossible moment, would come. Tristan, the man who had once brushed her aside, the man who had mocked her, had just declared his love for her. Not in private, not in secrecy, but in front of the very society that had tried to tear her down. It was an act of rebellion, a declaration of defiance against everything that had sought to keep them apart. Kit's voice shook as she found her words. "I love you too, Tristan," she whispered, her heart pounding as the truth left her lips. "I've always loved you." The confession was like a breath of fresh air, a release of everything she had been holding inside. And in that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. If only for an instant, the room erupted in a mixture of gasps and murmurs. But none of it mattered. Tristan stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out, trembling slightly as he cupped her cheek. "Then let's make this right," he said softly, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. And before she could fully process the magnitude of everything that had just happened, he kissed her. It was not a soft kiss, nor a tentative one. It was a kiss of passion, of years of unspoken emotions, of two people who had been circling each other for too long, unsure of what to say, how to act. But now, in front of everyone, they no longer had to pretend. The kiss was a declaration, as powerful as the word that had come before it. And it left Kit breathless, her heart racing, as she realized that her life had just changed forever. As they broke apart, Tristan took her hand, his gaze never leaving hers. "Kit," he said, his voice low and earnest, "will you be mine? Will you marry me?" The question hung between them, but Kit knew the answer without hesitation. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, the weight of everything they had endured and everything they could become finally sinking in. The scandal of the letter, the gossip, the judgment. It all faded away in the face of this new beginning. Tristan had not just defended her honor, he had claimed her as his own. And as the room erupted into applause, Kit realized that this was only the beginning of their story. The rest of their lives stretched out before them, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally exactly where she was meant to be. The days leading up to their wedding were a whirlwind of emotions, uncertainties, and overwhelming joy. Kit had spent years learning to survive in a world that constantly sought to define her by its expectations, but nothing in her life had prepared her for the intensity of what it meant to be at the center of a royal wedding, especially one to a man who had once seemed so distant, so cold. Yet now, as the grand day approached, she realized how little she truly knew about the man she was about to marry. The transformation between them had been slow but undeniable, and in the weeks following the dramatic scene at Lady Peton's soiree, something had blossomed between her and Tristan that neither could have predicted. She had come to realize that beneath his polished exterior and aristocratic demeanor was a man who had struggled with his own vulnerabilities, his own fears about being seen, truly seen, for who he was beneath the crown of privilege he wore. And for the first time, Kit understood him in ways that went beyond words or reason. She had seen the way his eyes softened when he spoke of his past, the loneliness that had shaped him, the responsibilities that had weighed him down. He was no longer the man who had dismissed her as unworthy of his time or affection. He had become a man who held her hand through moments of uncertainty, who stood by her side with unshakable resolve, proving that their love was more than a fleeting fancy, more than a passing attraction. It was something real, something tangible, something they could both build upon. Still, despite the undeniable connection that had formed between them, Kit found herself consumed with self-doubt. She was preparing to marry the Duke, the man who would become her world. Yet the specter of her past, the shadow of all she had lost in society's cruel judgment, hovered over her. Would she ever truly belong in his world? Was she really worthy of a title she had never imagined for herself? Could she become the Duchess she was expected to be? Or was she doomed to always feel like an outsider, a woman who had never fit the mold of what society demanded? Her thoughts were restless, constantly tumbling over one another, as she tried to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was about to become. Tristan had never once hinted that she needed a change, that she needed to be anything other than herself. And yet, the weight of the expectations that came with the title of Duchess loomed over her. Kit knew she would need to find a way to step into the role, to accept the responsibility that came with her new place in society. But could she ever truly shed the lingering fears that she wasn't enough? The morning of the wedding arrived with the soft glow of a late summer sun filtering through the windows of Ashworth House. Kit stood before the mirror in her bridal gown, the delicate lace and satin shimmering in the light as the weight of the moment settled over her. Her heart raced as she tried to steady herself. It wasn't nerves about the ceremony itself. It was about the life that would follow, the life where she would be by Tristan's side, where she would navigate a world that had once been closed to her, the life where she would become his Duchess. The day had come so quickly, so unexpectedly, and yet there was no part of her that regretted it. Not anymore. She could hear the soft sounds of guests arriving, the chatter and excitement filtering through the walls, but Kit was lost in her own thoughts. She barely heard her mother's voice calling out to her, urging her to hurry. Her father, too, appeared at the door, his face a picture of pride, and it made Kit pause for a moment. It was the first time she had truly felt his pride in her, the first time she felt that he saw her not as a reflection of his own successes or failures, but as a woman capable of standing on her own. "You look beautiful," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. Kit smiled, though it was bittersweet. "Thank you, Papa." The moment of quiet reflection ended when her mother entered the room, bustling with the energy of a woman who had prepared for this day for what felt like a lifetime. She was already dressed in her finest gown, her hair perfectly coiffed, and she had that look in her eyes. Pride, yes, but also a certain wariness. It was the same look Kit had seen so many times before when her mother was preparing to enter society's gaze. "It's time," her mother said, her voice a mixture of excitement and nerves. Kit nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. It was time, and there was no turning back now. She would walk down the aisle as the woman she had always been, unsure, uncertain, but determined. She was ready. As Kit made her way down the aisle of St. George's Church, the air was thick with anticipation. The pews were filled with well-dressed guests, their eyes on her as she walked forward, each step heavier than the last. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the expectations of society that had always judged her, always scrutinized her every move. But in this moment, nothing mattered but the man waiting for her at the altar. Tristan stood there, tall and regal in his formal attire, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pulse race. There was no hint of doubt, no hesitation in his gaze, only unwavering devotion. And for the first time in a long time, Kit felt like she belonged. The ceremony was a blur of vows and promises, the words drifting past her in a haze of emotion. She hardly registered the priest's words as she stared into Tristan's eyes, the world around them fading into the background. This was the moment they had both been waiting for, the moment where their past, their doubts, and their fears could no longer hold them back. Kit's heart swelled with emotion so intense she could barely breathe as Tristan spoke his vows to her, his voice steady and true. "I vow to love you, to protect you, to stand by you in every season of life, in every storm we may face," he said, his words a promise that echoed deep within her soul. And then it was her turn. Kit had never been the one to express her feelings openly, always careful to protect herself from hurt, to guard her heart from the possibility of rejection. But as she spoke her vows to Tristan, something shifted. The words flowed from her lips with sincerity that surprised even her. "I vow to be your partner, your equal, in every sense," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I vow to stand by you, to support you, and to love you with all that I am. I choose you, Tristan, not because of your title, but because of who you are." There was a brief silence after her words, as if the weight of the moment was felt by everyone present. Then Tristan reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her skin, a silent promise that spoke louder than anything either of them could say. The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a soft, lingering connection that was a culmination of years of doubt, longing, and pain. And when they finally pulled away, the world erupted in applause, but it was a look in Tristan's eyes that made Kit's heart race, the look of a man who had found something he hadn't known he was searching for. As they left the church, the celebrations continued, but for Kit, everything felt different now. She was no longer just a daughter of a noble family, or the woman who had been humiliated by society's whispers. She was now the Duchess of Stormholt, but more importantly, she was Tristan's wife, his equal. As the days turned into weeks, Kit's life began to settle into a rhythm. The grand estates of Stormholt House became her home, and she threw herself into the responsibilities that came with her new role. She worked on charity endeavors, reaching out to the less fortunate and trying to make a difference in a world that had always been so indifferent to the plight of the poor. It was work that fulfilled her, that made her feel like she was finally making a real difference, not just fulfilling some societal expectation of what a duchess should be. But as the weeks turned into months, there was a new joy that settled in her heart, one she hadn't expected. Tristan was a man of quiet strength, not just in public, but in their private moments together. He had transformed from the aloof Duke who had once been so distant into a partner, someone who saw her, who loved her for everything she was. It wasn't always easy, of course. They had their disagreements, their moments of uncertainty, but they faced everything together. And through it all, Kit realized that her title didn't define her. What defined her was the life she was building with Tristan, the love they had for each other, the respect they had for each other, and the future they were creating together. When the news of Kit's pregnancy reached Stormholt, Tristan's joy was palpable. It was a joy that only seemed to grow with each passing day as they prepared for the arrival of their child. Kit too, felt an overwhelming sense of happiness, though there were still moments of fear. Could she truly be the mother she wanted to be? Could she navigate the delicate balance between her duties as Duchess and the demands of motherhood? She didn't know. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't facing it alone. Tristan was by her side, as he had been from the very beginning. When their son, Ned, was born, it was a moment of pure joy, one that sealed their bond in a way nothing else could. And as Kit looked down at her son, she realized that she had become something she had never thought possible. A mother, a partner, and a woman who had found her place in a world that had once seemed so daunting. As the days passed and the life they had built together grew, Kit knew that this was only the beginning. 6 months into married life at Stormhope Manor, the reality of their union began to settle in, and despite the intense love they shared, both Kit and Tristan were not immune to the pressures that came with their new roles. Autumn had arrived, painting the countryside in vibrant hues of gold and amber, but within the walls of the manor, the air felt heavy, burdened with unspoken tensions. Kit, though deeply content with her life as Tristan's wife, found herself grappling with doubts that she had not expected. The whirlwind of her engagement, the joyous wedding, and the early months of their marriage had left her little time to process the changes within herself. She had never imagined how difficult it would be to juggle the responsibilities of being a duchess with the new dynamics of her marriage. As a young woman who had spent much of her life in the shadows of others' expectations, Kit was struggling to understand her place in this world. Tristan had been a rock, unwavering in his support and love, but even he couldn't fully understand the weight she carried as a woman now thrust into the spotlight. Her charity work had become a lifeline, a place where she could find purpose and direction outside the constraints of the ton. Yet, even that was starting to feel like a performance. She had found a way to carve out her own space, yes, but at times it felt as though it was all just for show. Her work had meaning, but it was constantly under the watchful eyes of the ton. She was scrutinized not just as Kit, the woman, but as Kit, the Duchess, and that distinction had begun to wear her down. Every movement, every word, every gesture was measured. She had hoped to be more than the polished figurehead that society expected her to be, but sometimes it felt as though that was all she was allowed to be. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and the cracks that started to show in their relationship slowly began to widen. Tristan, too, was not without his burdens. He had always been the Duke, the man who commanded respect, who was expected to make decisions not just for his estate, but for the future of his people. But in the months following their wedding, the weight of leadership seemed to grow heavier on his shoulders. His duties were endless. Meetings with the council, managing the estate, attending to the affairs of the ton, and with every passing day, he became more distant. Not distant in the way that he had been before, cold and unfeeling, but distant in the sense that he was consumed with the enormity of his responsibilities. Kit could see the toll it was taking on him, the lines of stress deepening around his eyes, the way his movements had become more deliberate, less spontaneous. She had always admired his strength, his quiet determination, but it was becoming harder to watch the man she loved slip away from her, inch by inch. He was still present, still there physically, but emotionally, there were times when it felt like he was a stranger. Kit tried to reach out to him, to find the connection they had once shared, but he was consumed by his duties, by the pressure to lead. It wasn't just the ton or the expectations that weighed on him. It was a looming uncertainty of the future, the fear of not being enough. Kit knew that look in his eyes all too well, the one that mirrored her own doubts. They were both struggling in silence, caught in the unrelenting tide of their own expectations. One day, as the crisp autumn air chilled the manor grounds, Kit received an unexpected letter from her mother. It was brief, a simple invitation to visit, but the words stirred something deep inside her. Her mother's letters had always been practical, full of advice and guidance, but this one carried an undertone of something else, something unspoken. It was as though her mother sensed her unrest, her confusion. Kit felt the pull to go, to leave the manor for a time, to escape the weight of it all. She needed to find herself again, to remind herself who she was outside the title of Duchess, outside the expectations. But as the thought of leaving Stormhope crept into her mind, so did the guilt. How could she leave Tristan, even for a short time? How could she step away from the man who had stood by her, the man who had given her everything? She could feel the conflict in her chest, the pull of duty and love on one side, and the yearning for personal freedom on the other. That night, she found herself pacing the garden at Stormholt, the cold air nipping at her skin, as a familiar weight of indecision pressed upon her. She had come so far, fought so hard to carve out a place in this world, and yet she felt as though she was losing herself. The woman she had been before, the one who was free of titles, of expectations, was slipping further away with each passing day. She needed to reconnect with that part of herself, the part that had made her who she was before the Duchess of Stormholt, the part that was still her. But at what cost? As Kit walked, the flickering light of a lantern in the distance caught her eye. It was Tristan, standing alone on the edge of the garden, looking out into the night. She approached him quietly, not wanting to disturb his solitude, but when he turned to face her, she saw something in his eyes that stopped her in her tracks. It was pain, raw and unguarded, a reflection of the same turmoil she had been feeling. "Kit," he said softly, his voice strained. "I've been thinking. I don't want to lose you." The words hit her like a punch to the chest, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had been so wrapped up in her own confusion, in her own doubts, that she hadn't noticed how deeply Tristan was struggling. She could see it now in the lines of his face, in the way his hands trembled at his sides. He was afraid of losing her, just as she was afraid of losing herself. "I don't want to lose you either," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the autumn leaves. Tristan stepped closer, his eyes searching hers for something, for reassurance. "Then why do you seem so distant?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I've tried, Kit. I've tried to be here for you, to support you, but it feels like we're slipping away from each other, like we're losing ourselves in everything that's expected of us." The words hung between them, a painful truth neither of them wanted to face. Kit's throat tightened as the weight of his words settled over her. They were both struggling, both so afraid of losing themselves, yet they hadn't known how to communicate it to each other. She had thought that her doubts were hers alone to bear, but in that moment, she realized that Tristan, too, was drowning in the same sea of expectations. "I need to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to find myself again, to remember who I am outside of all of this." Tristan's face crumpled, his eyes flashing with pain. "You're already enough, Kit," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You've always been enough. But I understand. I can't keep you here if it's not what you need." Kit felt the tears well in her eyes as she reached out to him, taking his hand in hers. "I love you, Tristan," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need to find the woman I was before, the woman who wasn't defined by titles, by what people think. I need to find her again before I can truly be the Duchess you deserve." Tristan didn't respond immediately, and for a long moment they stood there, hands intertwined, in the quiet darkness of the garden. Finally he spoke, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Then go," he said softly. "Go and find yourself. I'll be here when you return. We'll figure this out together. Kit, but you have to know that I love you with everything I am." Kit nodded, her heart aching with the complexity of their love. She knew it was the right decision, but the thought of leaving Tristan behind, even for a short while, tore at her. But in the end, she knew that they couldn't move forward until she found herself again. With a final lingering kiss, Kit left the garden, and the road ahead stretched before her, uncertain, but filled with the promise of rediscovery. 5 years had passed since Kit had walked away from Stormholt Manor, leaving behind the whirlwind of responsibility and expectations that had come with being the Duchess of Stormholt, the woman who had once been trapped under the weight of society's demands. 5 years had passed since she had taken the time to find herself again, to redefine her identity, and to discover a version of herself that was neither shaped by her past nor bound by the future that others had envisioned for her. Those years had been transformative, not just for her, but for Tristan as well. When she had left, the distance between them had felt like a chasm that neither of them knew how to cross. It had been the hardest decision of her life, to step away from the man she loved, to leave the life they had built together in search of something deeper, something more authentic. But in the end, it had been the only choice. She had needed to rediscover the woman she was before the titles, the pressures, the world's gaze that defined her. And Tristan, though heartbroken, had supported her, perhaps in ways she hadn't understood at the time. He had respected her need for space, and he had given her the freedom to explore who she was without the constraints of her title. He had waited for her. When she had returned, it had been with a sense of clarity she had never thought possible. She was no longer just Kit, the Duchess, the woman who lived her life according to others' expectations. She was Kit, whole, confident, and unafraid to live life on her own terms. Tristan had seen the change in her the moment she had stepped back into Stormholt Manor, a transformation that was as profound as it was subtle. She was the same woman he had fallen in love with, but she was also someone new, someone stronger, more grounded, someone who no longer felt the need to prove herself to anyone. She had found her voice, not just as his wife, but as herself. It wasn't long before their relationship blossomed again, but this time it was different. There was no longer a sense of pressure, no unspoken weight to their connection. It was a partnership, a genuine meeting of minds and hearts, and it was built on trust, mutual respect, and the love they had for each other that had weathered the storm of their past. Together, they had become a team, not just in the public eye, but in private, too. The love they shared was something deeper, something more resilient than it had ever been before. Over the years, they had traveled together, explored the world beyond Stormholt, and worked side by side to improve the lives of those less fortunate. Kit had found herself in her charitable efforts, advocating for causes that were close to her heart, ensuring that women's voices were heard, and that the poor and marginalized had the support they needed to thrive. Tristan, too, had become more than just a duke. He had become a man who recognized his own imperfections, who embraced vulnerability and understood that true leadership wasn't just about power, it was about service. The growth they had experienced as individuals had only strengthened their bond, and their love was now a partnership of equals. With each passing year, they had built something beautiful together, a life full of purpose, passion, and a sense of mutual understanding. And yet, despite all they had accomplished, Kit knew that her journey was far from over. She had always been driven, always been restless for change and growth. And now, 5 years later, as she sat beneath the massive oak tree at Stormholt with Tristan by her side, and their 3 children playing nearby, she realized just how far they had come. Their children, Ned, now a bright-eyed boy of 5, and 2 younger siblings, Eleanor and Thomas, ran through the fields, their laughter filling the air, the image of a family that was more than just a product of wealth and privilege. They were a family built on love, on choice, on the kind of commitment that transcended titles. Kit smiled as she watched them, her heart swelling with pride. She had come to understand, over the years, that being a duchess was not about fitting into a mold that others had made for her. It wasn't about conforming to the expectations of society, or adhering to a narrow definition of what a woman of her station should be. It was about finding her own path, carving out a space where she could be true to herself and still make a difference in the world. The title had been a symbol of her position in society, but it was not who she was. Who she was someone who had the courage to speak her truth, to live authentically, and to create a life that mattered. And as she looked at Tristan, standing tall beside her, the father of their children, the man who had stood by her side through every storm, she realized that they had created something even more precious than a noble title. They had created a legacy. The legacy they had built together was one of love, of equality, of purpose. They had transformed Stormholt from a place of wealth and privilege into a beacon of social reform, a place where people from all walks of life were welcomed, supported, and empowered. Kit's work had focused on education for women, advocating for the rights of the poor, and building institutions that would ensure that future generations would have the opportunities they had been denied. Tristan had used his influence to help bring about change within the political realm, advocating for fairer policies and pushing for greater accountability from those in power. Together, they had made a difference, and together, they had created a home, not just for themselves, but for everyone who crossed their threshold. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the estate, and Kit felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had once feared that she would never find a place where she truly belonged, that she would always be defined by the judgments of others. But now, she knew that she had found it, in Tristan's arms, in their children's laughter, in the life they had built. She was no longer the woman she had once been, the woman who doubted herself, who felt invisible. She had become something better, something stronger. And now, as the years stretched before her, she was no longer defined by her title, but by her actions, her love, and the legacy she and Tristan had created. She had become herself, not in spite of the title of Duchess, but with it, allowing it to be a part of who she was, but not the whole of her. And as the children continued to run through the fields, Tristan's hand found hers, and Kit looked up at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "We did it," she whispered, her voice full of contentment. "We really did it." Tristan squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with the same love and pride that had carried them through every trial, every challenge they had faced. "No, Kit," he said, his voice low and full of emotion. "You did it. You became everything you ever needed to be. You made me proud every single day, and I will continue to stand by you always." Kit felt her heart swell with love as she leaned into him, the weight of their shared journey settling into her bones. They had both changed, had both grown, but they had done it together, and together they had created a future full of hope, love, and purpose. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she gazed out at the life they had built, "for believing in me." As the day turned to night, the family gathered beneath the oak tree, their laughter echoing in the air, and Kit realized that this was it, the moment she had always dreamed of. This was the life she had fought for. This was the life she had built. And in this moment, with her family by her side, Kit knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The journey had been long, filled with heartache, doubt, and growth, but it had led her here, to a place of peace, to a life that was hers, and to a future that was theirs to create. And as she looked at Tristan, their hands clasped tightly together, she knew that the love there would last forever,